Welcome to the City-REDI podcast. Today, we're talking about how universities, colleges and employers should work together to improve innovation and productivity. I'm Chris Millward. I'm Professor of Practice in Education Policy at the University of Birmingham. I'm talking today with Peter Creticos. He's President and Executive Director of the Institute for Work and the Economy in Chicago in the USA, and also Professor Ewart, who is Professor of Education, Training and Skills at the University of Oxford. Welcome both. So Peter, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your role?
Sure. Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this. The Institute for Work and the Economy was established in 2000 as a policy collaborative on workforce and economic development. We were originally part of Northern Illinois University, just outside of Chicago, and separated as an independent not-for-profit in the early noughts. My role is been primarily focused on sort of the juncture, the intersection of workforce and economic development policy as practice here in the United States, and have participated in some international engagements with the OECD in a similar vein.
Great, thanks. And Ewart, could you tell us about your role?
Well, I've spent 35 years working in the field of research on the links between skills, the economy, the labour market and work. I used to run an ESRC research centre on this topic, and I've done quite a lot of work with policymakers across the 4 UK countries, in New Zealand, in Australia. Most recently, I was a member of the rather short-lived UK Government Skills and Productivity Board, and I'm currently a member of the board member of the Scottish Funding Council, board member of City of Glasgow College, which is the largest college in the whole of Scotland, and probably for the purposes of this talk, the most relevant thing is I'm on the skills board of Oxfordshire Local Enterprise Partnership.
Terrific, thanks. So Peter, if I could start with you, how would you describe the pattern of relationships between universities, colleges and employers in Chicago and Illinois?
More generally, in the United States, there's always been, historically, there's been a very strong working relationship between public and private institutions, educational institutions, and corporations, primarily on the research side, where there's been a lot of joint investment coming from corporate partners with universities. Here in Chicago, there is a long history of collaboration between universities, employers, and unions, frankly, on public policy issues that pertain to skills development, skills recognition, education that is focused to meeting the needs of employers in the area, and it largely breaks between public and private institutions in the sense that the public institutions, publicly funded institutions, because of their mandate for providing extension services, which connects people with sort of real life experiences and jobs, will probably have a more robust kinds of working relationships with employers than the private universities in that same area. Now, in research, it's flipped. The private universities, I think, probably have a stronger relationship, but when it comes to things that pertain to employment and job development and job creation, there's a I would argue that there is a greater bit of attention on the public institutions to paying attention to what the employer's demands are, what the community's demands are, and also the role of unions and other organizations in terms of that mix.
I wondered, is there anything you want to say about how universities and community colleges work together in that context, Peter?
Yeah. So for those who are not familiar with our system here in the United States, We have 2-year institutions called community colleges. They once were called junior colleges. They do provide a 2-year associate's degree, but they also are very much engaged directly with employers within their service areas in meeting specific demands with respect to training, as well as providing direct services to employers on a contract basis in terms of education needs. How the 2-year institutions and the 4-year institutions connect is that there are articulation agreements often between the 2-year institutions and the 4-year institutions, so that the college coursework that is done at the 2-year is recognized at the 4-year. It's still a bit rocky in places, but there's been a real effort to try to smooth that so that the time and money that's spent by students at the 2-year institutions, which are quite a bit more affordable than the 4-year institutions, because there is, at least in Illinois, there's a direct tax support for these 2-year college institutions. That time is not lost, and the education is not lost in the transition. So it's getting better. But it is something that they are trying to smooth that process between the 2 and the 4.
And how important is the national, the state, and the local? So you have federal government, state government, and local. How do you see the interaction of that?
Yeah, so the federal government comes into the mix in a couple of areas. One is there are several of the direct student assistance programs are funded through federal programs like Pell Grants, which often goes to students in the 2-year institutions, through college loans, which come through largely the federal system and so forth, student loans. In addition, what the federal system does is that it finances sort of the backbone of the workforce development system here across the state. Now, a lot of that is controlled locally, so that the money comes from the feds, passes through the state governments into local areas that are governed by local workforce boards that are public-private partnerships by their design. So there is that. Now that money typically goes for training as opposed to education, and it's often targeted to specific groups that where they won't necessarily have the means to be able to obtain the training independently. So it's subsidized work. At the state level, there may be other resources that come into play. In this case, in Illinois, there has been a substantial effort around energy. And so the state has developed its own funding resources to support transition to renewable energies, hydrogen, and other sorts of resources. And with a strong focus on economic justice and environmental justice. At the local level, in addition to what they may receive from the feds and through the state, you'll also see often employers partnering with the local workforce boards in developing specific programs that are, again, often targeted to populations that are underrepresented or underserved in the community, underrepresented economically and underserved.
Thanks. So you obviously have a really unique perspective, having worked with different parts of the UK. I wondered how that looked relative to your experience of different parts of the UK and how the collaboration works.
Okay, well, I think what Peter's outlined sounds more like Scotland than it sounds like England, partly because things are more devolved in Scotland. In England, it's very patchy. There are real problems in England with at both national and local level with the relationship between the skills system and employers. I mean, one of the things you have to remember in the UK as a whole is that employers are fairly weakly organised collectively. And that's problems got worse and worse. The UK government stopped funding sectoral bodies, skills bodies for employers, and they abolished the UK Commission for Employment and Skills, which in a sense tried to bring all this together across the 4 UK nations. So there is a nasty vacuum at national level in England. And at a local level in England, you've got the huge problem that only some parts of the country have, do the local authorities, local government, actually have any money to spend on skills. Those parts of the country that got a devolution deal have got some money, though it's not very much, and it's mainly allocated to spending on adults, not on initial schooling or initial college or university. And other parts of the country have nothing, effectively. And in fact, their adult education budget is dealt with centrally by a contracting exercise by central government in a remarkably centralised and incredibly inefficient way, which seems guaranteed not to meet local needs. So England's is really a bit of a mess, whereas Scotland, there's better, partly because it's a smaller country, there's better articulation between colleges and universities. So the model that Peter's described about how universities and colleges work together with articulation agreements, that is exactly replicated in Scotland, certainly doesn't exist in most of England. And more generally, the Scots are piloting a couple of things called tertiary provision pathfinders, which are local attempts to try and restructure initial educational provision to better meet the needs of employers and the local economy. So one provision pathfinder is a very rural area of Scotland, the borders with England, and the other is in the northeast around Aberdeen, which is experiencing all the economic and employment effects of a transition towards net zero in a city that's based around the oil and gas industry. So there are some interesting things going on in Scotland, but England, it's a really problematic picture. And it's not clear to me that it's going to get better in the immediate future.
If I pick up on that last point, how important, given what you've just said, is devolution and meaningful and consistent devolution for improvement?
Oh, I think it's absolutely critical. I mean, one of the things that people from abroad, from practically every other developed country, always remark upon if they actually look in detail at particularly the English skill system is how centralised it is. For Peter's sort of purposes, everything that's important is dealt with at federal level. So the federal government, the UK government, deals with all of the detail. It directly funds all state schools in England, through various mechanisms, but ultimately the Secretary of State is responsible for them. It runs the student loan scheme. It runs the funding for further education colleges, which are vocational colleges. Everything is very, very, very centralised. And it's very dysfunctional. I mean, we've spent the last 40 years gradually centralising all the power and decision-making to one postcode in London, rather than actually devolve. That's a little quote from Andy Burnham. That was a quip he made a while back. But I think it's very true. And we need to the centre needs to start letting go. We need to align our skill systems with local needs, local priorities, and allow local actors to have a bigger say about where the funding goes, because at the moment we're wildly over-centralised.
Thanks. Peter, I wonder if you could give us a good example that has really boosted skills and productivity and innovation where you are.
Well, I want to pick up something that Ewart was talking about first, because I think it's important to understand how these differences do evolve. So in the U.S., we have a very decentralized structure with respect to unions, whereas in the U.K. and in England, you have a very centralized structure with unions. And I think some of this is patterns repeat themselves. And so, we have the AFL-CIO, American Federation of Labor, Congress of International, or CIO. It is a membership organization of unions, and those power structures start at the local and move up. And so when you think of skills training, when you think, and I'm just using this as an example, that structure. So when you think of these kinds of structures in terms of how then they get replicated in terms of the workforce system, it follows a similar pattern. And so I do think that it some of it's government, but some of it's also just the way our systems have evolved in very different ways. And so then these structures kind of mimic that. So I apologize for diverting us on this, but anyway, the in terms of examples in Chicago, Illinois, that boosted skills for productivity and innovation, we have there have been a few examples, or several examples. For one, one in particular that I'm watching is one that is through the Illinois Innovation Network. Illinois Innovation Network has been established of all the public universities in the state of Illinois. And their work has been focused on developing new models for university engagement on workforce and economic development practices and policies across the state. One initiative that I've been involved in that is yet to produce anything directly, but is something that has some promise, have been a couple of energy-related initiatives where this group has been very involved in a series of comprehensive proposals to the Department of Energy, in the transition, in one case to hydrogen, and another in the electrification of industrial processes, heat processes, where they're seeking to take coursework within the universities, track that with training programs that, in terms of the application, and then involve those in the actual transition activities towards these new energy systems. It's a complex problem, but it's one where you see multiple universities each trying to contribute their own specialty to this process.
Thanks. Ewart, I wondered if you wanted to reflect on what changes we should be making in the UK, regionally, nationally, to really stimulate sustained activity of the kind that Peter's been talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, first of all, underpinning it has got to be a belief that devolution is the direction to go. As you know, in the last sort of 4 or 5 years, there have been limited amounts of devolution around the skills budget in England. They're not progressing very fast, and I have certainly seen several commentators say that the Department for Education is the central government department most averse to the concept of devolution. And on my experience, I'd probably have to agree with that. I think DFE really struggle with the idea of letting go. I think, regionally, you can see some of the new, relatively new mayoral combined authorities starting to really take this seriously, beginning to do the kinds of things that are necessary, not just in terms of having a skills strategy, but I think much more importantly, linking that up with economic development, workforce planning, trying to get people who are far away from the labour market re-engaged and trying to find them jobs where they can earn a decent living. So job quality, job improvement, innovation support at various levels, not just at the really high-tech level, but also this kind of innovation support that vocational colleges can supply, in terms of technology adoption and upskilling the management of small and medium-sized enterprises. But it's a joined-up package, and I think that's the key thing, that it's something that we're really weak at in England. We have separate little sort of streams of activities. So we have skills, and then we divide that up into different sorts of skills. We have very limited emphasis on business support. Innovation policy is dealt with by a separate central government ministry. and net zero and all the job and skill challenges that creates is seen as being yet another box. And so I think where you're more likely to be able to do this sort of joining up is at regional level, regional and local. And obviously regional in Britain is by American standards really rather a small area. So we ought to be able to do this. And we're going to have to do it if we really want to make a dent in our productivity record, which has flatlined since 2010. And in terms of a just transition to net zero.
Interestingly, regions may be small in the context of the US, but in terms of population size, comparable to Wales, Scotland, Ireland, Norway, New Zealand, countries that are, developing that joined-up approach across further and higher education, research, as well as skills. So there's no reason why we couldn't think in those terms.
No, and I think the other thing is that we really need to think about the incentives in England to get colleges and universities to work together. Some do, but they're mainly doing that against the actual incentives that our funding structures provide them with. We're really poor at that, and we're going to have to think much harder about getting colleges and universities to work together more closely. In Wales and in Scotland, the direction of travel is towards a tertiary system. There'll still be colleges, there'll still be universities, but there'll be one system, much more joined up than at present, and working much more collaboratively than they do now.
Peter, do you think there's some areas of work that can't really be well served by a local orientation towards policy?
Yeah, I do. And I think that the emergence of gig work or independent work is an area that I don't think any of our systems are prepared to support. Because what's interesting about that, if you think it through, is that the focus of attention in gig work is actually the individual. And they are working in larger markets they're working in markets that may well go beyond their local industry, their local commerce. And part of the challenge is, how do you support that? What is it that they need to know, and how do they learn it and get those resources when they need it? What's the nature of competition within their field? Because oftentimes now they're competing even transnationally, internationally, in terms of other people. And it's one where you don't have employers to poll. You don't have employers to go to in your community and say, what is it that you need? Instead, what you really have to do is to be able to anticipate what it is that the gig workers will potentially need, given the mix that exists within your community of these workers, and then trying to align resources to support that. I'm not sure that locals are prepared to do that. I don't know if national systems, or in our case, statewide systems, are the appropriate place as well. We certainly don't have the information systems. And frankly, that is a role, we haven't talked about this, but that is a role where central government can play an enormous, can be an enormous benefit. Because it's those labor market information systems that right now are essentially aligned to report to decision makers about what's the economy doing, but they aren't aligned to informing the individuals what are the paths that they can take, given the information that's available about what they do, their potential career pathways, and so forth. And so there, I do think that there's a role for central government to play, because I think that the task is too big for a local to develop that kind of information system. And again, we're in some cases we're talking about global labor markets, and so I think it's a very different kind of model that we need to be addressing here, and an environment, and it's not one that It's not one where I think the existing structures, at least in the United States, which are very localized, are prepared to handle properly.
So a need for more sophisticated information systems which recognize the pathways for individuals in global labor markets, which takes, we talked about a federal, state, local level, but takes you into the global level as well, with the national state perhaps being best placed to be able to do that.
At least in my mind, I think that's something that's a starting point, and our labor market information systems are poorly equipped with respect to that. But I also think that our focus on looking at local employers' needs also is a distraction for in the policy realm in terms of developing systems that support independent workers.
Thanks. Just to finish off, I wondered, you've obviously worked in different parts of the world. Are there any countries you think are getting this really right and we ought to learn from?
Yeah, they probably are, but the catch is that the learning won't transfer very easily. For the point that, in a sense, Peter's raised, that different countries have got different structures and historical traditions and different political systems and different policy systems, and therefore, what works great in the Netherlands or Germany is probably not going to work terribly great in England. I think we've got to think very hard about our own solutions. Where I do think some learning could take place would be across the 4 UK nations, since they do share quite a lot of history. They do share a general, UK level political system, and they do share the same set of national employers. So it would be really nice if the 4 governments chose to learn from one another. At the moment, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland spend quite a lot of time learning from each other. The big partner that just sits outside saying, "Oh, I'm much too important to talk to or listen to these small people," is, of course, the UK, or otherwise known as the English government in this particular case. We've got to learn more from across the UK, because there are various sort of experiments and developments in Scotland and Wales that England could learn a lot from if it chose to be willing to do so.
And in the US context, Peter, are you looking to other countries, or is it more about states and city regions learning from each other?
Oh, I'm always looking to other countries. But there is a translational problem. I mean, I'll give you an example. We're working on some ideas in the apprenticeship field. And one way that we're very much like the UK is an apprenticeship. Our apprenticeships are post-secondary. They start basically after the person completes their secondary education. In Germany and other places, it's during their high school, what we call high school, their secondary education years, and so as a result, I mean, they offer alternative pathways. So, for instance, in the U.S., our apprenticeship programs need to be tied to a job and a career at the end of the apprenticeship. As my understanding, in Germany and Switzerland, you can take your apprenticeship and then move into post-secondary education, which is not deemed a success here. That's a failure of the system, because you're not employing the individual at the end of that apprenticeship period. Excuse me. So I do think that there are, now recognizing that, we still can learn from the Germans. We can still learn in terms of how it is that they develop it, and maybe move our policies and practices in such a way so as to recognize this alternative pathway. And so there is the value. But there again, though, the German system is very much embedded in their culture. It's an agreement between the local union and the Chamber of Commerce in terms of what the needs are, and then they train to those particular needs. We don't have a comparable system here. And every time I've seen somebody try to adopt the German system, it's another failure, because they don't have the culture to support that.
That's great. Thank you, Peter, Ewart. Terrific insights, a lot of food for thought for policy and also for the debate. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.